Hello and welcome to Mission San Luis, a 17th century Spanish mission to the Apalachee Indians. I'm Jerry Lee and I'm an archaeologist with Florida's Bureau of Archaeological Research. I'm stationed here at the mission. Now today we're standing in the reconstructed Council House at San Luis, and I'd like to share with you a little information that we've learned through archaeology about the Council House here at the mission. First, a little background. Council houses were ubiquitous elements of native towns in most of Spanish La Florida during the Spanish colonial period, and their beginnings must go back long before European contact. They were symbols of the village itself and of the village chief's authority. In 1602, the governor of La Florida in St. Augustine, in talking about the Indian towns along the Atlantic coast, he said they could barely be called villages because they had little more than their community house. Villagers' homes, he said, were scattered about at intervals on the edges of the woods. Now, council houses served as the seat of native government. The village chief met with his subordinate leaders to talk of affairs of the village and beyond. Discussions about and preparations for war took place in the council house. In San Luis Council House in the late 1670s, Apalachee leaders planned a successful raid against the Chisca Indians to the west who had been harassing the Apalachees. The chief had meetings with Spaniards in the council house during formal visitations. In most provincial missions, there was only a single Spanish friar in residence, and periodically the governor from St. Augustine or his official representative would visit all the missions. The visitor was supposed to make sure that things were going well, at least from the Spanish viewpoint. He also heard complaints from the natives and tried to address them, although it was often only lip service. The visitor sometimes left a series of orders, and these were posted in the council house. Of course, in nearly all the missions, it was the friar who had to explain the orders, since very few Indians were literate. Since San Luis was such a large mission and the provincial capital, there were a few Apalachees who could read and even write Spanish. There are a couple of documents that indicate Indians who broke Spanish rules were held in the council house. One of them relates that a Timucuan Indian at a mission east of Apalachee was placed in stocks at that mission's council house. Now, those couple of mentions aside, I don't think that the council house was regularly used to detain prisoners. The council house was the site of dances and festivals, often attended by Franciscan friars during the mission period, just to be certain that no untoward behavior occurred. San Luis Council House was on the Mission Plaza, and the Apalachees played a violent ball game in that plaza for about 20 years before it was banned. One account related that many of the rituals associated with the ball game occurred inside the council house. Another function of the council house was as a lodge for travelers, whether native or European. A lot of Europeans found themselves in need of this sort of hospitality, so we have quite a few written records of council houses and what took place in them. For instance, Europeans shipwrecked off the Atlantic coast had to make their way back to Spanish and later English territories, and were fed and lodged in council houses from village to village along the way. Many of the descriptions of council houses are similar. They are round structures of wood and thatch or straw. They're pretty big. One description from the late 17th century along the Atlantic coast relates that one was over 80 feet in diameter. Various writers mention them as holding from 200 to 2,000 and even 3,000 persons. Some descriptions of council houses mention a skylight or large opening in the top. Doorways are usually said to be small and narrow. The descriptions usually mention benches or beds around the outer wall of the building. A central fireplace or hearth was usually described with an open dance ground around it. One traveler noted that smaller individual cooking fires were sometimes placed at the bench's edge. Another Spaniard related that to keep away the biting flies, a reference to mosquitoes, they built little fires, especially under their beds. Those benches or beds were raised about a yard above the floor, and the chief's seating bench was raised a little higher than the others. The chief's bench was also directly across from the single entryway. The consumption of casina, or black drink, a dark tea brewed from Yaupon holly leaves, was usually limited to the council house. The Apalachee council houses were not reserved for men, as a number of mission period documents refer specifically to women in the council house. Women attended public meetings and dances there. Women also assisted with cleaning and maintaining the council house. One Spanish order from the late 17th century required that a field be planted for the poor widows in consideration that they are assisting in the tasks that occur in the council house. Now, during the early archaeological testing phase of San Luis, a topographic survey identified a flat platform at the southeastern edge of a big circular ridge that would later be seen to represent the Mission Plaza. Several depressions were also noted on that survey to the east and south of the platform. A small 2-meter test unit on the east side of the platform recorded a thick layer of orange clay, remnants of a prepared clay floor. In the mid-1980s, more extensive excavations confirmed the identification of the structure on the southeast edge of the Mission Plaza as San Luis Council House. Excavations in the late 1990s produced additional information on the building and allowed for the reconstruction of the council house that we're standing in today. It turned out that that platform identified in the topographic survey wasn't entirely natural. The west side of the platform was already pretty flat, but the east half had to be artificially built up, probably using clay mined from those depressions east and south of the building. The east half of the structure exhibited a prepared clay floor, while the west half had a sandier floor. Now, it makes sense intuitively that the size of council houses was based on the village it served. San Luis was the provincial capital and either the largest or among the largest mission communities for the entire time it was in this location. A census in 1675 revealed that San Luis served 1,400 Apalachees, and their council house was quite large, at about 120 feet in diameter. The plan of the council house shows that there was a tier of benches along the outer wall of the building. Now, cross-sectioning some of these posts along the outer wall, cross-sectioning is when we cut posts in half to examine their size and the shape of their base and their depth. But it proved that the outer bench supports inside the wall were not as deeply set in the ground as the outer wall posts. Then about 4 meters interior of the outer benches was a second interior tier of benches. Nearly all of the interior tier of bench posts were deeply set supports, and I think it's possible that some of them extended up with cross braces to brace the wall plate that carried much of the weight of the structure. Beneath both sets of benches were a number of smudge pits, regularly spaced in some places and less so in others. And we'll talk more about smudge pits in a little bit. Within and incorporated into the interior tier of benches were 8 very large support posts with big post holes that extended toward the center of the building. The inner tier of benches ringed an area about 20 meters in diameter, and in the center of that area was a great central hearth or fireplace just over 4 meters in diameter. We found evidence of a probable doorway that opened to the northwest onto the plaza. One post mold was situated about 50 centimeters outside the outer wall, and 50 centimeters from it, and also outside the wall, was a mass of burned clay. Taken together, we think that this was the narrow entry into the structure. Now, the east side of the council house was floored with clay to build up the platform. The fire that destroyed the structure in 1704 fired that clay pretty hard, but there were still areas of intense scorching in several places in front of the outer benches that suggested that some individual fires had been placed before them. The later excavations isolated one of those smaller hearths between the two sets of benches on the northwest side of the structure. This confirms that traveler's description of smaller cooking fires being placed near the benches. Now, I mentioned the smudge pits that were found beneath both tiers of benches. When these were first seen, they resembled post moles, but when they were profiled, when we cut them in half, they were often not as deep as most post moles. The bottoms of the smudge pits were filled with charred material, mostly carbonized corn cobs. And the soil around their profiles had been fired red or yellow, the result of a hot but slow, long-burning fire. Sometimes the ring of scorched soil around the smudge pits could be seen from the very first time it was noted. I made reference to the Spaniard who said the Indians kept the biting flies away by making little fires, especially under their beds. The smudge pits in San Luis Council House were a form of insect control. While the smudge pits were regularly spaced beneath the benches in the northeastern part of the building, there are apparently some gaps in their distribution on the west side of the structure. The early excavations revealed two linear features, they called them both feature 8, that extended between the two tiers of benches in the northeastern part of the structure. The later fieldwork located an identical feature between the two sets of benches on the northwest. We called it feature 95. They were shallow, linear ditches or trenches dug into the floor of the council house. The fill of the trenches contained no post-mission period artifacts, and their functions are a real mystery. Now, it looks like the council house was largely constructed without the use of wrought hardware. We only found about 15 intact hand-wrought spikes and nails, so the Appalachians' traditional construction methods, like lashing wooden elements together, seem to have been followed. All of the wood that was identified from the post moles turned out to be pine. There was a lot of burned clay, but most of it was associated with the clay floor. There was very little daub, so the council house appears to have been a post and thatch structure, just as those descriptions suggested. There's a mathematical regularity in this monumental construction. It's almost perfectly circular, a tribute to the Appalachians' skills as builders. So what did we find in the council house? Well, not as much as we've come to expect from excavations this size at San Luis. We excavated about 40% of the council house and recovered about 9,000 counted sherds of pottery. As a public building, the council house was swept and maintained. Remember those poor widows. The relatively small number of artifacts was a result of those tasks they were assisting with. There were two concentrations of artifacts. One was within the central hearth, and the area just inside the outer wall was another. It looks like some trash was swept into the fireplace or underneath the outer benches, out of sight, out of mind. Nearly all, over 98% of the pottery that we recovered was made by the Indians, and less than 2% was imported Spanish or Asian ceramics. The council house was primarily an Appalachian context. We did find a wide range of Majalicas, the tin enameled pottery associated with the Spaniards, and they were the types of majalicas that were produced in Mexico from the 1650s to about 1700. Of the small quantity of porcelain that we found, most was from China, but a few fragments from Japan were identified. Now, this is interesting since Japan was not officially involved with the Spaniards' Manila trade in silks and porcelains, but apparently a little contraband Japanese porcelain eventually found its way to San Luis. Now, since one function of the council house was as a lodge, it is interesting to note the little bit of Indian pottery that doesn't appear to have been manufactured by local Appalachee potters. There was a handful of Alachua cob-marked sherds that might indicate travelers from the east in Timucua province. Of course, we really don't know if it was actual Timucuan Indians carrying these pots to San Luis, or if the pots arrived through trade or some other fashion. There was a fragment of an unusual cord-marked pottery tempered with shell in one of the post holes of the major support posts. Cord-marked pottery is when a paddle wrapped in cordage is pressed against the still wet clay while they're forming the pot. Now, the Appalachee potters didn't use much shell to temper their pottery, but some of the Apalachicola potters up along the Chattahoochee River did. There was a lot of contact between San Luis and the Indians along the Chattahoochee River to the north, and this sherd may have originated in that region. This shell-tempered, cord-marked pottery has been found almost nowhere else at San Luis. One sort of artifact escaped the sweeping. We found thousands of little flint or chert flakes, and a lot of them were very small flakes, probably a byproduct of flint knapping or flint working. We also identified almost 20 small historic arrow points, so it looks like arrow point production was one activity that took place in the council house. One of those arrow points was chipped from green bottle glass. The Appalachians found that glass could be worked just like flint. Another was of milky, opaque quartz. That type of stone is unusual around San Luis, but more common to the north, and maybe that point's origins, like the pottery, were somewhere off to the north. Other weaponry items included a handful of gun flints indicative of flintlock muskets, examples of lead shot, and parts from a matchlock musket. Now, these weaponry artifacts might have belonged to Spaniards who spent time in the council house, but Appalachian warriors were the larger portion of the Spanish militia, and firearms were more common among the Appalachians in the late mission period, so they may have belonged to them. We recovered over 560 glass beads and a few glass pendants. Most of the beads were very small, referred to as seed beads, but some of the larger glass beads were types that would have been typical of the later years of the mission period. Of all the beads, blue was the most common color. We also found several fragments of little sheet brass bells. Now, these are sometimes called hawk's bells, but you might think of them as little jingle bells. Most times when the Spaniards wrote about what the Appalachians were paid with for their labor, they mentioned glass beads and little bells. One of the brass bells from the council house had a maker's mark on it, and a bell with an identical maker's mark was found in a trash deposit associated with the chief's house a short distance away. Now, what did we learn about the mission diet? Well, the soils at San Luis are acidic and not favorable for the preservation of calcium-based items like bone or shell. We found animal bone, but mostly as small, unidentifiable fragments. Just about the only identified animal bone from within the council house was part of a goat jawbone. Now, jawbone was in the first level of excavation, so it may not have been from the mission period. And so far, goat has not been identified from good mission contexts. The bone that was from the samples from the central hearth were just little burned fragments. There were about half a dozen polished chert flakes identified from the later council house excavations, and I think these are evidence of chickens being prepared for cooking. The Appalachians raised pigs and chickens for their own food and also for sale or barter with the Spaniards. When Spanish farmers and ranchers came into Appalachia province after 1675, they were able to dominate the trade in pigs, and a Franciscan friar recorded the Appalachians' displeasure about it. Now, not many chicken bones have been identified from San Luis, but I think chickens and their eggs were very important in the mission diet. Chickens are one of the kinds of birds that ingest stones, grit, and pretty much anything they can swallow to help grind hard seeds and tough foods in their gizzards. Now, the gizzard is like a rock tumbler, and the stones or grit inside it get polished and smoothed. The items they ingest are called gastroliths, and they're very distinctive. The polished chert flakes that we identified are all from good mission contexts, and most of them are larger examples that probably entered the archaeological record when the bird was butchered. I have seen additional gastroliths from the early council house excavations that weren't recorded as smoothed during the early years of artifact analysis, so there are more of them than the half dozen we identified from the later field work. The upshot is that although we didn't recover any chicken bones, I believe we did find good evidence that chickens were on the menu in the council house. Burned and carbonized plant remains were better preserved. Samples were taken from the floor deposits, from the central hearth, and from the smudge pits. A range of different plants were identified. There were the usual food crops that we know the Appalachians planted: corn, beans, squashes, and sunflowers. There was also evidence of European-derived foods: wheat, watermelon, and peach. There were locally gathered nuts like hickory nuts and acorns. There were also locally gathered fruits like persimmons, maypop, plum, grape, and palm fruits, along with a range of plants that weren't food but still wound up in the archaeological record. Now, all the corn in those smudge pits beneath the benches was nearly all corn cob fragments, and they are evidence of large-scale corn production. Corn for export to St. Augustine or elsewhere wasn't left on the cob. The dried kernels were stripped off the cob and ground into meal, either for immediate use or for storage or for export. As corn production ramped up during the mission period, there must have been a huge quantity of these stripped cobs, and they were used as a slow-burning fuel in the little smudge pits. That wheat was found in this Appalachia context was surprising at first. Maybe it shouldn't be, since the first wheat farm on the eastern edge of Appalachia province had been established, flourished, and ended production all before San Luis was moved to this location. Several Spanish accounts mention that wheat grew pretty well in this area. Now, the two primary fuels in the central hearth were pine wood and hickory nutshells. A cooking oil was processed from hickory nuts, and it looks like a lot of it was produced at San Luis. Once the oil was extracted, the leftover nutshells were used as fuel. They're supposed to burn a little bit like charcoal briquettes. Now, Yaupon holly seeds were identified from the central hearth. I mentioned that the consumption of cassina or black drink was generally reserved for the council house. Cassina is prepared using the leaves of Yaupon holly, and it's likely that some of its seeds made their way into the hearth during the preparation of this beverage. One of the rituals associated with the ball game played by the Appalachians happened the night before a game. The chiefs of the opposing villages were to drink cassina in their council house all night until it made them sick. Beyond ritual use, cassina was consumed casually as well, and some Spaniards were fond of it too. There is a story which may have occurred in the council house at San Luis. A Spanish friar came to the council house to be served Cassina, and when it wasn't ready for him, he smashed the earthenware pots with a stick. Now, Yaupon holly is one of a few plants that contain natural caffeine, but a chemical study showed that it doesn't have all that much caffeine in it. The earlier Council House project also looked at soil chemistry within the Council House. Levels of extractable phosphorus, magnesium, and calcium suggested that besides the central fireplace, there was more human activity on the east side of the structure. Now, this would be across from the single entrance off the plaza and probably where the chiefs and other leaders would be seated. There's a lot of evidence of replacement of posts within the Council House, especially on the eastern side. Over much of the building, the outer wall posts were about 2.8 meters apart, but they were much closer together on the northeastern side, and it looks like additional outer wall posts were placed here. The major support posts within the interior tier of benches were very large and deeply set. The 8-post molds averaged nearly 50 centimeters in diameter. They all had flat bases, which indicates that they were finished with metal tools, such as saws or axes. The post holes dug to set them into place were also quite large and extended toward the center of the building. We found that we could recognize multiple post holes for all but one of the major supports, as many as 4 post holes for 2 of them. This was clear evidence that the major supports had been replaced and replaced multiple times. Now, during the early field work, the first 2 major supports were profiled, cut in half, and had absolute base elevations that varied by only 2 centimeters. During the later field work, we profiled the remaining 6 major supports and found that, taken together, there was nearly 30 centimeters difference between the absolute base elevations of the 8 major supports. We noticed that while there were significant differences in the base elevations of all 8 posts, there were 3 groups of major supports that had base elevations within a tight range of each other. The absolute base elevations of the easternmost to the northernmost major supports differed by 4 centimeters. The base elevations of the westernmost to the southernmost major supports varied by only 3 centimeters. The base elevations of the southeastern and northwestern major supports right across from each other varied by 4 centimeters. I think that when major supports needed replacement, they were replaced in sets rather than one at a time or all at once. To accomplish this, the Apalachee builders would have propped up the wall plate around the set of posts to be replaced. Now remember, the wall plate was the beam that must have rested on the big supports to bear most of the weight of the rafters. Groups of 3 or sometimes 2 new posts would be prepared and cut to virtually the same length. The old supports were removed and new post holes dug. The post holes were carefully backfilled or dug deeper to achieve just the right depth below the wall plate before the new set of posts was slid into place. To account for the multiple post holes of the major supports, this must have occurred several times. Now, if the Council House had been completely rebuilt at any time during the 17th century, the builders would have had to keep track of the geometric center of the structure, which was on the west side of the central hearth. Any change in the exact center would result in overlapping rows of features, and we just don't see that. The base elevations of the major supports in 3 very tight groupings also indicate a wall plate that didn't change in height much over time. It seems most likely to me that the Council House was simply refurbished in place as needed. During the later Council House excavations, we also tested the earthen ridge that delineates the Mission Plaza on either side of the council house. The excavation unit about 14 meters west of the council house was fairly typical of other places where we had sampled the ridge. There was a wide range of mission period artifacts, and quite a few of them, including over 600 potsherds. Our units about 6 meters north of the council house were something else. We uncovered very heavy midden or trash deposits that were about 50 centimeters thick and spread beyond the ridge toward the east. Our units here produced nearly 6,000 potsherds. As a point of reference, the units to the north were only about 8% of the excavation coverage of the council house, but they yielded 65% of the numbers of potsherds, as did the council house interior. There were some similarities between the council house floor deposits and the midden just to the north. Along with the pottery, there were several small arrow points and a sheet brass hawksbill. Remember the unusual shell-tempered, cord-marked potsherd that came from one of the major support post holes? Well, there were 10 potsherds of the same type within the midden, and while I couldn't fit any from the midden to the one from the council house, it seems possible that they are from the same vessel. I think those poor widows, or whoever was sweeping up the council house, were taking the sweepings through the door and tossing most of them off to the north, a short distance away. We also identified a neat feature beneath that midden deposit. Underneath all that trash was a cooking pit. Because of where it became visible, this feature must date to the earliest period of San Luis, not too long after the mission was moved to this spot. Since it was used for cooking, there was some burned bone preserved in it. Most of it was little unidentifiable fragments, but there were a few small fish bones and turtle shell that were recognized. The only obvious European-derived artifact from it was a glass bead, but European food crops were identified from the charred botanical remains. Along with the native crops of corn, beans, and sunflower, wheat and cowpea or black-eyed pea was identified. This suggests that the Apalaches had already adopted these foods by the time San Luis was moved. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the council house at San Luis, and thanks for watching.